Exactly right. He's one of confidence. Always relatable.
Those are all open trees.
Good evening, everybody. There's an air of anticipation, and rightly so. And rightly so. It's wonderful to see you this evening, and on behalf of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and particularly on behalf of Henny, and his shoulders are very broad, and it's quite, it's got a lot of muscles. He had to carry a lot in the last number of years. And so we want to welcome you and thank you for your interest. And I trust that the evening will be one that will be profitable in more ways than one. I think the timing of the launch of the book, and it wasn't timed in a particular way, it just happened that it's the launch tonight. It comes at a time when there are a lot of questions in the air about what's going on in the country, what's going on with money, and who's fooling who, and who's capturing who, and so I think that context is also one that certainly interests me. But the book has a particular focus, and I think it's long overdue. And I don't want to spoil any of the fun, but I think it's one of those publications that we certainly at the Institute have been looking forward to for a long time. And so without further ado, I want to ask you to engage with the issues, and Henny and the panel are quite able and willing to deal with some of these vexing questions. We're going to have to start preparing ourselves to ask difficult questions, to be engaged in difficult things, because our future doesn't look too bright at the moment. And so it's important for citizens like ourselves to take our responsibility seriously. And I think that a night like tonight is a good start. And yes, while the book focuses primarily on the past, it is also something for us to think about, that it can happen at any time to any group of people. And as a country, we are at a very, very precarious phase of our democracy. And so with those words, I'd like to welcome all of you, and particularly I want to welcome the panel. And it is now my pleasure to yield control of the evening to our moderator, Professor Timothy.
Thank you very much. Stanley, I'm not sure if you introduced yourself. Stanley Henkelman, the Executive Director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in an increasingly dry Cape Town in terms of our water access, for this public dialogue on challenging corrupt networks, the long shadow from apartheid to state capture. Now we hear phrases and cliches around radical economic transformation. We are very familiar with the Zuptas, and South Africans are asking themselves, where are we headed? How did we get here? And our dialogue will entice us to respond to some of these very vexing questions. My name is Tim Murithi. I'm the head of the Justice and Peace Building Program here at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. I wear a second hat as the Extraordinary Professor of African Studies at Center for African Studies, University of Free State in Bloemfontein. So on a personal note for me, this discussion tonight, this dialogue is extremely important as a practitioner of what we call transitional justice and a scholar of Africa's past and current affairs. I'm looking very much forward to this discussion that we're going to have tonight. It's a public dialogue and not a book launch. It does look like a book launch, but it's actually supposed to be more of a public dialogue. So it is a public dialogue with a twist, let me put it that way. And you can purchase the books just outside for a reduced rate. The book has already been launched in Johannesburg and Kailicha. So instead of having another book launch, the idea was in fact to broaden the discussion and engage directly with reflections as to how citizens can become much more engaged in challenging corrupt networks, which is why we can describe this public dialogue as a public dialogue with a bit of a twist. In terms of our current situation, our misruling party announced 3 days ago, that a judicial commission of inquiry into state capture, following a frustrating few months or years, depending on your point of view, to very debilitating and draining political machinations that have left you and I feeling exhausted, fatigued with all the intrigue. The former public protector's report, The State of Capture, recommended the establishment of a national commission to inquire into this phenomenon. Our hopes and aspirations are that it will not be another whitewash along the lines of the disappointing Seriti Commission, which on the arms deal, which Henny and others were involved with. So the overriding question for us is, how did we get here? And we can roll out a number of cliches to try to respond to that question. Money is the root of all evil. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And I think Henny, on my left, who I will introduce in a moment, set out to trace the historical trajectory of the capture of the state in the seminal book of his Apartheid, Guns and Money, which will be the anchor of our dialogue. And he is, I think, attempting to answer that question. How did we get here? By painstakingly researching and analyzing the events that preceded South Africa's transition to freedom and democracy in 1994. Henny's book takes on the question of how we got here head on, and it delves into our past. And Henny has written, essentially, I would argue, the prequel to South Africa's post-liberation life. It was an era of murky intrigue, the deep state, the shadow state, international corrupt money networks that remain concealed and hidden from unsuspecting masses. I would argue it brilliantly illustrates and debunks a number of very important myths, and I think they will speak to that issue tonight. One being, and the most significant being, that there was nothing so new about the new South Africa. Specifically on the issue of confronting and eradicating the practice of capturing the state, which the Apartheid regime left with us as its most insidious legacy to subsequent generations of South Africans and Africans across the continent. So I would like to stop talking and congratulate Henny and Michael, who I will also introduce, who was the lead researcher of this historical work. And it is a book with a difference. And as somebody who's been spending a bit of time with books, try and take my word for it. Brilliantly researched. The analysis is of previously unaccessed material, so it's a treasure trove. It might be a little bit early to call it a masterpiece of revelation. I'm going a bit too far in. But it does provide new insights which will debunk a number of myths, and we'll talk about those myths. And to help us to navigate this important topic, we're joined by a panel of very eminent activists and researchers who will introduce our conversation to kickstart our discussion tonight. I will start with the team that is responsible for getting us here tonight. Henny van Vuuren, we've already mentioned. He is now the director of Open Secrets and describes himself as an activist writer focusing on economic crimes and human rights violations, working from within civil society to challenge corruption and the abuse of power, speaking truth to power, so to speak. Henny is the author of this book, which was meticulously researched by our second panelist, Michael Marchant. That's him. Who is a key member of the research team and is also now a staff member at Open Secrets, which is the NGO that has emerged from this 5-year project that Henny was undertaking. And a very late addition, 2 late additions to the program, Janine Obel, who is with us here. And she has been working in civil society, currently works as a coordinator for My Vote Counts campaign, focusing on the link between party funding and state capture. And she has worked in civil society for more than 10 years, including in Nyathelo, the Catholic Parliamentary Office and the Institute for Security Studies. And then last but not least, Nkosikona Swatoy, who is an activist from Kalisha, has been involved in the Social Justice Coalition, recently finished his term with them as the chairperson, currently working with Difuno Kwazi on Reclaim the City campaigns that seek to dismantle the spatial apartheid in Cape Town and ensure affordable housing for all those who need it. If you received a copy of our earlier program, Murray Hunter would also be on the program. He has relinquished his seat gracefully, but he is within the floor and will speak from the floor. He works with the Right to Know campaign. And if you look into the second page of the book, both Murray and Michael are mentioned as having played a key role in researching this very important book. So without much further ado, I would like to hand over firstly to Henny and Michael, who will speak for about 10 minutes each, and then over to Janine, then Nkosikona, and then we will open the floor for dialogue. Henny, you have the floor.
Thanks, Tim. Can I stand? Thanks, Tim. I'm going to stand so that we can see one another. Thank you very much for those very warm words of introduction, and thanks to everybody for being here tonight. I think it's an exciting opportunity for us not only to talk about the research that we've unearthed in the process of undertaking the work that led to the publication of Apartheid, Guns and Money, but also an opportunity to share this in dialogue with Janine and Nkosikona and talk about other struggles that civil society are involved in to tackle issues of corruption and state capture. And I think we get so caught up in the Gupta-Zupta moment that we forget about some of the many other challenges that are faced across this country in many other ways in the manner in which our elites behave. But let me turn to the book, and I'm going to speak for a couple of minutes, and Mike as well, and we'd like to talk a little bit about some of the linkages between the past and the present, why we wrote this book, and perhaps what we regard as some of the important issues that we've identified that have come out of this research. I should say at the beginning, being at the IJR for us tonight is very much being at home, because for the past 3 odd years before we Open Secrets set off on a journey as a separate new organization, we were able to work from within the IJR over the last 3 years, both Michael and myself and other colleagues, and we're very grateful for the support that the IJR has given this project over many years. I think it's been the argument that we've heard the IJR making, that without real truth, it's impossible for us to have justice. And I think we hope that this book is a contribution towards truth or a better understanding of our past. There's no doubt many other stories we haven't touched on, and some of those you may even be able to speak to as all of us who are here tonight. I think we all carry stories with us that contribute to our knowledge about our past. But turning to why we decided to write this particular book, I think it was a sense of frustration looking at issues like the arms deal. And if we look at the really fundamental first big significant corruption scandal in South Africa that captured our political space, that benefited a group of European arms companies, and that has not yet resulted in any tangible conviction. There have been 1 or 2 convictions, but even the people that were convicted, we think about Shabir Sheikh and others, are known to play golf today, and they managed to get out of prison free. And Sheikh spending some time in prison is nothing compared to the European arms companies who have never been held responsible for the bribery that they were involved in and the damaging impact that they've had on our democracy. And that, I think, leaves a real sense that corruption, I think one of the myths that we tried to focus on that Tim mentioned was the sense that that corruption is something new, or state capture is something new in our democracy, and therefore is something that is almost inherent in a constitutional democracy like ours, and it also follows that it's inherent in a black-led government like ours. And I think that the book tries to debunk this myth by explaining the network of people who have profited in pretty extraordinary ways from their relationship with the state. The second myth was that the apartheid state from the late 70s to the early 90s was an isolated state. Now, we recall in the 1977, the United Nations Security Council decided to pass sanctions that prohibited the sale, particularly of weapons, to the apartheid regime. That time, the war in Angola has been raging for some time. The security forces are active throughout the region, and there are processes of destabilization that continue into the 1980s. And as a result of the popular uprisings in Soweto and elsewhere, the murder of Steve Biko, the international community decides to put in place arms sanctions, which are mandatory, and then oil sanctions. And so this has created a myth that the South African military establishment, which was far more powerful during the 1980s, for those who have lived through that period would have a memory of it, but was far more powerful and played a far more significant role in the South African economy at that period than they do today. The myth that was created, rather, was that South Africa was isolated to the extent that we generated, as a country somehow, but Armscor in particular, the state-owned arms company, generated this amazing technology from scratch to develop all kind of sophisticated weaponry that was then deployed in apartheid's wars within the region. And we've questioned that logic, and there's often talk about technology coming from other places. The state of Israel is often mentioned, and there have been some really good books written, one by Sasha Polakov-Saransky, that sets out some of those relationships. But we've never really understood the role of all the many countries that profited from this type of relationship. And when we talk about profiting, of course, they profited out of a massive secretive slush fund that the government had at the time. The Special Defence Account, also known as the Secret Defence Account by many, and which still exists today. It's still a line item in defence expenditure, and we should add, was also used in the post-apartheid arms deal as a means to hide, we believe, some of the corruption that took place there. But it was during the height of apartheid, the Special Defence Account was used to house most of the cash that was used to buy weapons. Now, in rand value today, we're talking about approximately R500 billion, 500 billion rand, that was spent in procuring weapons between 1974 and 1994. We managed to ascertain that because some of this was made known at the TRC, but it took us almost 4 years working with the South African History Archive and others and Lawyers for Human Rights to get the TRC documents that detail this, a report from the Auditor General in 1996-97 that sets out the details of some of this cash. The Auditor General at the time had almost no insight into the use of those funds and how they were utilized. And what was necessary was to create a criminal network. And a criminal network, the way in which we understand many of the network of companies that benefit from corruption in our SOEs today. It was a criminal network that there's a chart on the wall if you have a chance to look at, and it's in the book as well, which we call the arms money machine. And it describes a network of front companies that were established in Liberia and Panama, and with the assistance of one particular bank in Belgium, the Credit Bank Belgium, and its subsidiary bank in Luxembourg, which, as many of you know, is a tax haven. It's a small country that makes most of its cash off secretive banking deals, much of which is criminal. And those two banks were supporters of the apartheid regime. The managers behind the banks, a man by the name of Andre Vlerik, and the management were out-and-out supporters of apartheid. Ideologically, they worked hard at creating a network of supporters in Europe that supported the apartheid regime. And the bank which they headed, and Vlerik was the former Minister of Finance in Belgium, the bank that he headed co-created this network that was set up to enable money laundering around the world. So they created the front companies. The bank's officers their names would appear on the same front companies. And the bank profited massively. Today it's one of the top 20 wealthiest companies investment banks in Europe. The most prominent business school in Belgium is named after Andre Vlerik, who in our mind is complicit in this criminality. And their names and the details of what they've been involved in simply have not been revealed fully to the public, and certainly were never revealed fully to the public by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the money that they were moving around the world, of course, was the cash that was needed to buy weapons. So once the money was reassembled in Luxembourg, secretly, where no one had access or insight into that, it would be used to buy weapons, often from the countries the 5 countries that were members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, who were selling weapons. Those same countries that were responsible for policing the international system, for ensuring that the weapons weren't sold. And we talked today about the need to reform the UN Security Council. I think this is another motivation to argue that we have these 5 countries, the United States, China, the Soviet Union, France and the United Kingdom, who historically we have given an enormous amount of power to. But in different ways, as evidence has shown that we've collected over the last 5 years, corporations in those countries were responsible for busting sanctions. And they were only effective in doing so because they worked together with this deep state network in intelligence agencies who were protective of many of these networks, the arms companies themselves, middlemen, and of course the political parties who would often benefit from kickbacks that went, we believe, to political parties in places like Europe and elsewhere, and the politicians themselves. We see names in France like Jacques Chirac, who was the Prime Minister and later on President, who are people who are almost certainly sending their advisors in to meet with the South African heads of military intelligence, together with French intelligence and others, and who are in agreement to very complex deals, trade-offs that include providing very sophisticated weaponry at the time. And so the book in these few minutes is an exploration of that network that profited, of that network that's embedded within this deep state, but equally it's a network that's deeply embedded in the private sector. Maybe Mike will talk a little bit about information that we gleaned also from the private sector in South Africa. But I think what for us was incredibly important was to talk about the complicity of the private sector as well in a crime against humanity. Now, we're not saying that because this is an attempt just to attack the private sector. It's often it's a difficult conversation to have in this country because at the moment there's a whole group of people, like there's paid Twitter, there's a whole other kind of paid Twitter out there who doesn't like us to talk about the complicity of private actors and how they fuel corruption. And the story of apartheid corruption, of the additional oxygen that was given to the apartheid regime, is certainly a story as well, we would argue, of complicity by a network of private actors. Some of those private actors extended into the present, and I'm going to end off, just before I hand over to Mike, by one example which we spoke about in Khayelitsha on Monday night at Isivivana, and is an important one for us in the book. And it's a reminder of how incredibly hard it was for ordinary people to challenge the system. I don't think we look back glibly now and say, well, we got our hands on these documents, I think we are able to tell the truth. I think, if anything, it's an extraordinary appreciation of the enormous power that the anti-apartheid movement was faced with. And when we talk about issues of its rising security state today, I think there are reasons why it troubles us within the state, because we come from this moment in our history where there was this incredible network that operated in such a sinister way. One person who we focused on, and is a very incredibly brave individual, was the person of Dulcie September, the daughter of Cape Town, who is imprisoned by the apartheid state for her own anti-apartheid activities in the 1960s. She eventually goes into exile, joins the ANC subsequently, and by the early 1980s, she's the ANC's representative in Luxembourg, Switzerland, and France. She's based in Paris. And Dulcie September, it's quite extraordinary when you work through her papers, as we did in University of Fort Hare and elsewhere. You see a very courageous, hard-working activist. That's what she was. She has no time for sexism within the movement. She has little time for what she perceives to be laziness, or those who like a drink. And she's focused on trying to uncover the networks that are linked to the arms trade. Working alone in Paris with groups of activists, mostly left-wing groups who are supporters of the anti-apartheid movement, you can see is trying to pick together this network. And a powerful example that we found was in a company called Thomson CSF. Thomson CSF was a collaborator with the apartheid regime, developing missiles from the late 1960s already. And we see in various documents how this French company, together with many other French state-owned armed companies, are involved in systematically busting sanctions in the 60s and the 70s, particularly through the 1980s, as this network becomes more covert, and as Dulcie September is investigating this from her little office in Paris. She opens her office one morning in 1988, and as she enters her office, she is shot. She's murdered by somebody who we don't know who that person is. We still haven't been able to identify her killer. What we have been able to find are traces of the kind of truths that she was trying to piece together at the time. And certainly she's concerned that somebody has called and she's getting threatening phone calls, that some of this might very well be linked to the same arms companies that she's investigating. By the early 1990s, and we can talk about our attempt to investigate her murder, but by the early 1990s, Dulcie September's murder has not yet been solved, and the negotiation process has started. Thomson CSF establishes an office in South Africa, and in fact, we found a letter that was written to we didn't include this in the book, that's written to the ANC, proposing that Thomson CSF wants to use images of Nelson Mandela in its advertising, and they offered to give the ANC funding in return for this. So the wisdom prevailed within the ANC at the time, and they rejected this offer. But by the late 1980s, Thomson CSF has changed its name. It's now known as Thales. Thales is one of the biggest arms companies that operate globally. And of course, Thales is one of the beneficiaries of the post-apartheid arms deal. It gets one of the smallest contracts in the post-apartheid arms deal, but you could argue that the effects of the alleged corruption that it's involved in is some of the most wicked, given that the bribes that it's alleged to have paid were primarily directed at our president, Jacob Zuma. And so for the last 15 years, we've had this incredible fight within the governing party, much of it which has been centered around our president's persona and a desire to ensure that these charges do not stick and he is not forced to appear in court. And while we may know about that, we may sometimes in the moments of Nkandla and of Gupta Gate and other things forget about this. We shouldn't forget that the one current that runs throughout the story are the same arms companies who've been doing very similar things. They fundamentally slow down the process of liberation by aiding the apartheid movement. And they've benefited from democracy by fundamentally undermining our democracy. And I think these are elements of this long shadow of corruption that we're still faced with as a country. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So I'm seeing in quite a few of the faces here potentially something that we saw up in Johannesburg at the launches, which is, are you sure? And we've actually have had a couple of people come up to Henny with the sort of incredulous question at the end of all this is like, are you not just trying to slip in a John le Carré novel through the back door and assure us all that it's well researched, but actually this is just a wild tale of state capture, of spies, of presidents sending emissaries into meetings with apartheid officials in order to break sanctions? A European bank based in Belgium that houses 800 bank accounts for Armscor. It sounds, in a sense, just all too much, right? And I think that's where I wanted to start and sort of move the conversation to, because I think, and this probably sounds rich coming from someone who worked as a researcher on the book, but I feel that the power and the weight of Apartheid Guns and Money is that we've been able to make it come out of the documents that we have found in South African archives. That there is not a claim that is made in any of the chapters, in any of these stories, where we cannot point to a specific document, a specific letter between leaders and businessmen and politicians that concretely put people in those positions. And I think it's very valuable to be able to have a conversation like that. And I'll give you one example, not to jump in on what I'm sure you will speak about with the party funding issue. But in South Africa, there's often been this idea that, well, we know they must have funded the National Party, right? This is what business do. This is what business does. And so there's no real value to be able to unopen those secrets. But I think what we've seen in the last few weeks is that it's incredibly valuable to be able to go and say, Naspers, as a company, you funded the National Party for 10 years through the 1980s, right up until the point where you lobbied P.W. Botha personally around about the same time that the Mnet contract was being negotiated. Now, many people have responded on social media to say, it's an open secret, which is ironic given the name of our organization. But I think that what we're finding is that there's deep value in being able to take what is an open secret and make it concrete and say, we have your letter of thanks, we have the letters where multi-billionaire Cape Townian local Christo Visa is described as a long-standing friend of the National Party. That is concrete and it can no longer be denied. And there's great value in being able to point to that, especially at a time where the rhetoric no longer wants to rely on evidence. But then the question does arise, how did you find this? And so I just want to chat, I think, a little bit, because I think it's quite valuable, about something that often comes across as quite boring, which is access to information in South Africa. So the book actually begins with the 40 tons of documents that were shipped to furnaces of Escor outside Pretoria and destroyed. But what we have found in the process of the book is that, contrary to what apartheid-era leaders and potentially contrary to what our democratic leaders would want you to know, there is an extensive apartheid archive that remains in Pretoria, in the Free State, in the Department of Defense archives, in the Arms Corps archives, we are assured, although we are still not allowed to see those particular documents, in the National Party records that have been sitting for many cases for decades in the University of the Free State archive, with researchers not accessing those. And through a very long-term process of using the Promotion of Access to Information Act, we have been able to slowly draw some of those records out from the state. Now, I think what we have found so disturbing in that process, and this is where it may seem like a bit of a contradiction, but stay with me here. The stuff that we've managed to draw out, in particular from the Department of Defense, and I suppose from the University of the Free State, tells these incredible stories. They tell they have the meeting memos where these banks, spies, and arms dealers are meeting, and they tell those stories. And there's much value in that. But what we were staggered by was the absolute reluctance of a democratic government and democratic departments to release those records. In many cases, the Department of Defense has taken 4.5 years. The standard practice of any government department is to ignore you until the statutory requirement kicks in, and then they hire lawyers to fight you. Now, I think it's down to two things. There is a bureaucratic logic in the state that desires secrecy and does not want us to know about these things. There's also a bureaucratic inefficiency. I don't think we'd want to claim a grand conspiracy in this regard. It's not like there's someone at the top pulling the strings and denying access to information at every turn. Sometimes it's just coming up against departments that are not well staffed, that are not aware of the documentation that they are sitting on. But I think potentially the deeper and more interesting reason, and this speaks to the continuities for Henny, is that many compromised individuals in a democratic state recognize that the record of our past is also deeply damning to them in its ability to tell us the stories of these continuities. And that is because of the relationships that they have formed. And so we often fall into this idea in South Africa, and let's go back to what Prof. Moriti was talking about. This idea that the Zupta clan uses the excuse of white monopoly capital and creates a bogeyman in order to distract from everyday corruption. And I think it's fascinating for us to have released a book called Apartheid, Guns and Money and have had absolutely no one from that clan show any interest in it. And I think it's safe to say because they're not genuinely, many of those groups, interested in telling a story about apartheid-era corruption. It's only about being able to leverage half-told stories and half-told truths to be able to distract the population from having a genuine discussion. And I think what we hope anyway is that this, being what we hope is a very evidence-based piece of work, can enter that debate in such a way that, as I said at the beginning to Tim, that irritates everyone a little bit, because that's generally a sign that you're doing the right thing, when no one's particularly happy. And no one's really picking it up and saying, rah, rah, we're right, because the story cannot fit into this false narrative of past and present corruption that are held up as some sort of comparison. I think just the final thing to say, to sort of drive this home, because it may be a question that comes up from the floor, so maybe just to preempt it. I think an example that typifies this has been the noise about ABSA that was made at the beginning of the year, which was something that Open Secrets was obviously very interested in when it appeared that there was new information about the ABSA Bancorp bailout at the end of, in the early 90s, and the money owed. And I think that as we've sort of had that conversation, and the way that that ABSA report was picked up by certain people to be a conversation about apartheid-era corruption, it's become very apparent that that is a story that is being operationalized in a political battle, number one. But the number two, the people that are using that story are quite happy to keep it at the superficial level in order to further an agenda. And I think what's interesting is that if we want to talk about a bank that made billions and billions out of apartheid and ask serious questions about why democratic government seems to show no interest in proceedings against such an institution in order to recoup billions that were siphoned out of the country, would it not be best to start with Credit Bank Belgium and Andre Valeric's legacy?
Thanks for that, Michael. I will ask Janine and Kosikona just to share with us very briefly some of the work they're doing now to address the current existing corruption. But I think before that, Michael said something very important. I think the power and the weight of the book is the sheer evidence that has been collected. So I'm glad that he blew his own horn a little bit there. I was getting a little bit lonely here. But it was an arduous undertaking. 110 interviews, reviewing the archives of apartheid era material locked away in private and public archives, more than 2 million pages of documents, 40,000 documents in 25 public archives, numerous collections, including in 7 countries where Henny traveled to: Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. So I was not exaggerating. It is a veritable tour de force in terms of sheer research, and I think a very, very important model for our undergraduates and postgraduates as to the kind of work. If you really want to produce work of significance, this is what it takes. So let that at least be a one takeaway for our scholars this evening. Very quickly, there are 7 myths mentioned in the book. I want to go through them very, very quickly. Myth number 1. Corruption is not a racial phenomenon. Apartheid regime lied and bribed and broke every rule in the book to bust sanctions. Myth 2, freedom signaled a clean break with the past. In fact, there is significant continuity in this deep state, secretive dealings, behind the scenes, manipulation of the perceptions of citizens. Myth 3, apartheid South Africa was isolated. In reality, it bought and sold and bartered and cooperated with corporations, government intelligence agencies. Myth 4, apartheid was self-sufficient. It smuggled a lot, technology, expertise, container loads of weapons, which fueled and prolonged the life of the regime. So it could have ended earlier. Interesting thought. Myth 5, apartheid was profitable. It was a casino economy at the time, an elite, very much like something that we're experiencing in the Gupta-Zupta kleptocracy. Myth 6, the defeat of apartheid was inevitable. In fact, the military intelligence believed they could carry on for 10 to 20 years beyond the transition. That's a very important thing to think about. And the final one, that we cannot undo this wrong, which is a myth. We need to begin to unpack the open secrets of the past and the crimes of profit. Just like those of murder, these crimes need to be challenged using advocacy and the law to pursue this goal. So now we have 2 individuals, activists, who are working on these issues as we speak. And I'm going to start with Janine, 5-7 minutes, and then Kosikona, 5-7 minutes, and then we go straight to the public. Janine.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to stay seated, and I hope you'll allow me to. I work for the organization called My Vote Counts, and our big project at the moment is around campaigning for more transparency around private political party funding. And downstairs from where we work is an environmental NGO, and 2 of their staff members have recently been sued by a company that says, a defamation case, that says that the things that they said in a course that they ran in Cape Town earlier this year, that those things were incorrect. So I'm nervous and I'm anxious because I'm going to be saying things, and I saw people here wearing suits and ties. It's not, for some of us, not our usual kind of environment, but I'll try. So what Henny is highlighting is financial transactions between those in power, be they political or administrative. Often the focus is on the financial transactions that take place between the administration and external parties. The gap in our legislation and political spaces is the lack of regulation on political party funding. We do not know enough about who is funding our political parties. We don't know enough about how much political parties receive or when they receive it. And Henny's book makes it very clear that the challenges that we face are systemic. These are not new, they happened during apartheid and they continue to happen today. So while it's very interesting to find out about who funded the National Party all those years ago, there's little that we can do with that information now. And this is because it will be mostly academic to go back and try to ascertain if those funds influenced policy or the preferential treatment from that government or political party to those donors. So what this highlights at least for us at MVC, is the need for political party funding transparency today. South Africa actually lags behind many African countries in regulating private political party funding. So if people say to you what they like, what our politicians like to say, that these are Western concepts, they're not. Just on the African continent, there are many African countries that already regulate political party funding and private political party funding. South Africa just seems to lack the will to do so. It is outrageous that over 20 years into our democracy, we still don't know who funds the institutions through which we exercise our constitutional electoral power. It is also outrageous that our parliament has failed to remedy this. We also need to ask questions about how is it possible that the capturing of state institutions and departments could reach the levels that it has reached today. How and why would our political leaders allow companies and individuals to behave in the manner in which we are now discovering? And it is also important that we ask the right questions, because as we continue to receive information about what is really going on, we start to get answers. For us at the MVC office, we've actually been following the Gupta email hashtag, and thus far a lot of the revelations have been around state institutions and people connected to those in power. We are still waiting to see if the information that is still going to be released will at least show us what is happening with regards to our political parties. So Zweli Mkhize, the ANC Treasurer General, has recently stated that the ANC has received money from the Guptas. And in the current context, I don't think anyone can argue that that funding did not come without expectations. So what this is showing, to us at MVC at least, is that state capture does not take place without political party capture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Gosikona said. I am from an organization called Reclaim the City. I am also part of a movement which is recently started called Unite Behind. But I'll just, a disclaimer, I was just told I was given 2 days to prepare for this talk today, so perhaps I'll just spend more time talking about the work that we do as Reclaim the City. And we are an organization that aims to undo or dismantle the legacy of apartheid in Cape Town, to be specific. Before I get to the work that we do, perhaps just it's important to reflect on what the Constitution says. The preamble of the Constitution of South Africa says, as I quote, "We are the people of South Africa. Recognize the injustices of our past. Honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land. Respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it." Our organization exists to dismantle the apartheid spatial setting in Cape Town. During the apartheid era in Cape Town, if you were to look at the spatial setting, can you just stand so that everyone sees me? No longer nervous now. If you were to look at the spatial setting of Cape Town during apartheid, you'd find that in the inner city it was not acceptable for a black person and a colored person to exist and to live. And that was informed by so many laws that came with the apartheid era. So as to mention the 1952 Group Areas Act, where most black and colored communities were displaced and pushed into the peripheries on the outskirts of the city, where it is very hard to develop and to deliver basic services. If you were to travel from Cape Town towards Somerset, I'm not sure if that's the north of Cape Town or south of Cape Town, the first 10 to 15 kilometers during the apartheid era would take you to what was known as the colored areas. The 15 to 20 kilometers would take you to what was known as the native yards. Those are Ulanga, Kuguletu, Philippi, and so on. And at some later stage in 1985, the establishment of Ikaelija. But if you had to take the same distance that you were to take during the apartheid era towards Somerset again, the first 10 kilometers in the inner city, you predominantly find white people staying in the inner city, and some few black and coloured elites who have made it to cross the bars of poverty and are able to earn decent salaries and are staying in decent accommodation. But if you have to take the same drive that it took during apartheid and now, the first 10 to 15 kilometers still takes you to what was known as the coloured areas. Those are Heideveld, Mannenberg, Athlone, and so on. Your 15 to 20 kilometers will take you still to what was known as the native yards. Your Langa Kogoleto Philippi, Lower Short, and in 35 kilometers in Khayelitsha. So what does that mean about Cape Town itself? There's 2 points that I want to make about how we relate to this book. The fact that it's not only the national government which is captured, but the provincial government and the local government as well. I'll support my points just now. Through working on the Stop the Sale campaign in Sea Point, advocating for a piece of land, which the size of it is the size of 2 rugby fields, on the main road of Sea Point. And that site is called the Tafelberg site, and amongst the 4 sites that we had when we started initially this campaign, the Tafelberg site was the only site at the time that was being sold to a private buyer. Initially, the site was earmarked for social housing so as to benefit the workers of Sea Point that have worked and existed in Sea Point for decades. There hasn't, till this very day today, a plan for accommodating the workers of Sea Point that have existed in what is known as the maids' quarters. That is where domestic workers, security guards, and all low-income earning workers are staying. And one of the rules that the body corporate has in 5 buildings in Sea Point is that domestic workers are not allowed to have visitors. That basically means that my mother is a domestic worker. I am not allowed to go and see and sleep over where my mom is working. And basically, the second thing on the rules that the 5 buildings have in Sea Point is that domestic workers are not allowed to cook. You tell me, for someone who earns below 2,400 rands in a city or in an area that is ranked number 3 as the most expensive city in South Africa, how are those people able to survive? We see a lot of capture by private property developers. So as to be specific, the white property power has captured our provincial government. During the sale of the Tafelberg site, when there were negotiations or the intergovernmental processes to look into what the site could be used for, a government official by the name of Gary Fisher, who was a special advisor of the Premier, Helen Zille, bought a site right opposite the Tafelberg site. That is the Equinox building, that is his company. And we felt that this man is a property developer, private property developer, and still a an advisor to the provincial government, so as to mention the Premier. That itself can be seen as how our state is captured. The fact that private property developers in places like Woodstock are able to buy pieces of land and buildings, and in that process do what apartheid did to our people, evict poor, black and colored people into the outskirts, into now what is known as the TRS, the temporary relocation areas, which are located in 40 to 30 kilometers outside the city. When an organization called the Social Justice Coalition raised issues around the budget of the city of Cape Town, we were able to see that within the utility budget, only 2% goes into the informal settlements, out of the 204 informal settlements that Cape Town has. And most of that money, which is meant to build infrastructure, including housing and toilets, goes into more affluent areas. That can also be seen as the capture of our city. Apartheid left a legacy for black and colored people that it is not acceptable for poor people, to be specific, to have accommodation in well-located areas. That basically doesn't mean that they're spatially segregated from the city, but it basically means that they're socially and economically segregated from the city and from the activities of the city itself. The fact that if you're poor and unemployed and staying in Cape Town, and you're black or colored, you are staying in areas like that are known as the colored areas in the black townships, then you have to spend more than 50 rands a day for you to go and look for work. The fact that Cape Town is still number 3 ranked as the most segregated city in our country portrays how our city is captured. And we relate to this book that speaks to the capture of government, but we like to stretch it. That our thinking should not only, or we should not see the state capture only as something that happens nationally. There are also instances in the local government where the government is not willing to regulate the private sector. If you have to look at the big cities, in conclusion, big cities like New York, London, and so on, if a private property developer buys a piece of land or buys a building, a portion to it will be dedicated to social housing. Why is it in South Africa that we have this housing crisis that the private sector continues to be unregulated? Why is it that in big cities like New York and London, where we've seen how private sector has contributed in addressing the housing crisis for people to get affordable housing, why is it our government is not willing to adopt such models so as to provide space for people to exist in well-located areas and to benefit on the economic activities of the city and to also undo what apartheid did to our people? With those words, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kosikona, for that perspective. City capture is a whole new lexicon for us to engage with. Look, I think I want to open it right away to the floor. We have ideally 30-40 minutes for discussion. So we're going to take 3 rounds of questions at a time. But the request is that you keep it as concise as possible. If it's a question, please lead with the question. But comments and lengthy statements are reserved for the refreshments afterwards. Roger, go for it.
Congratulations, sounds a very formidable piece of work. Just a couple of quick questions.
Introduction.
Sorry?
Your name?
Oh, Roger Southall. Annie, I just wonder whether you can reflect a little bit on the way in which the law protects these interests. You've implied it protects them a lot.
It's like interest.
Yeah, and the laws of, you never get it right, defamation and so forth. They seem to be very strict, particularly strict in Britain, I understand, but maybe elsewhere. And how the law has also helped you, and the balance. And the other issue is for anybody, is the issue of state capture and influence. Can we differentiate between them? I wonder whether the term state capture has come to be so fashionable because actually implied the very direct political influence in terms of appointments to cabinet and to parastatals. Whether it's just a more extreme version of what was gone on previously, or is it distinctively different? How do we distinguish state capture from just ordinary, well-known pressure from business to get the sort of things which we're talking about in terms of Cape Town and so forth?
And Michael might have 1 or 2 points on that as well. 2 more? Yes, the middle there.
Hi everybody, my name is Mark Engel. My sons are my academic at UCT, but not in any of these, not in politics. I just wondered, you mentioned that from what you said, the apartheid government certainly had things really well oiled, and certainly with the arms, they could probably go on for another 20 years, I think is what you mentioned, in terms of the structures they had in place. And I just wonder, in your humble opinion, what actually then got us to the point that we became a democracy, if they could still have gone on for so much longer? Thanks.
Last one, that lady next to you.
Hi, Elise Brown. I'm just wondering, my understanding is that the ANC, or the resistance to the apartheid regime, was also armed, was also equipped with arms. And I'm wondering if you talk about that in the book, and also if these same companies that were arming the apartheid regime, were they also arming the resistance? Because that happens now, I believe. People arm both sides and just make money every way they can.
Thank you. Shall we start with those 3? And then we'll come for a second round. I think any of yours is welcome.
Well, I'll shoot with 2, but I'm going to leave the state capture maybe for us all to reflect on in different ways. Just firstly on the question that Roger spoke about, the law, and I think it's a really important question for us, was the role of the law. There are many great benefits to living in a constitutional democracy, and it's a good reminder of the fact that, firstly, we were able to access information which under apartheid was a criminal offence. So most information concerning defence expenditure, what we didn't, I think we're pointing towards is that up to 30% of the GDP at its height, according to some economists, was invested in the armaments sector, so more broadly into the military-industrial complex. So the ability to even report on any attempt at sanctions busting. There was, of course, the sort of parades organised by the SADF and arms corps brochures, but the real nuts and bolts of who was involved and who was profiting was something that journalists couldn't report on, and if they did, they'd go to jail. So it was very clear under the Defence Act, something that P.W. Botha and his henchmen put in place. And for us, it was the frustration of using the access to information legislation, and I say frustration because we have a law through the Promotion of Access to Information Act, PIA, which frustrates many activists. I think those within the Right to Know network can speak quite powerfully to many communities across our country. It's not our story alone who have struggled to be able to access information in the same way we have, and we had to rely on pro bono lawyers through the Lawyers for Human Rights, working with the South African History Archive, who just non-stop kept on grinding away at government departments who refused to give us access to information, as Mike was saying. And that was I think if we were trying to do something shorter in a very short period of time, we wouldn't have been able to. If we were under-resourced, small community organization without a network of supporters, we wouldn't have been able to. This is very much why I think we say this is a collective effort, because it did involve the help of many others. The defamation issues were real, and the CER, Centre for Environmental Rights, the company in Kolobeni, what is the company's name again? Australian Minerals. Sorry. MRC. So I think we should say MRC's name more often, because these bunch of Australian crooks have really put our, and I think we should say this, because the more we say this in civil society, the more we protect those two lawyers who went and spoke about the activities that are alleged that this company was involved in. And they've decided to target these lawyers because they were speaking about the activities that around the Wild Coast area, and we know of activists who were murdered there. I'm not saying the company murdered the activists, but there are many questions that need to be asked, and I think that defamation is a tool used by the powerful, and I think that this MRC's activities is exactly an attempt to suppress the public's ability to speak about matters that deserve airing and deserve our public discussion. Defamation we had a very good media lawyer who had to work through every single footnote with us, and Zanele Mbuyisa, who was brilliant and has protected us, I think, and has helped us to push the boundaries where we've been able to. But it was a real reminder that without the evidence, we wouldn't be able to do this. And we did speak to at least one publisher in the UK who who were interested in publishing there, and then they started to get cold feet, in addition to Jacana, so just to get the message out. And the words were, they're worried that they're all sort of tourists sort of litigation tourists who go to a place like the UK and use it as a good place to start prosecuting against you. And it's a reminder exactly of how corporate actors, in particular, exercise an enormous threat, I think, on our ability to be able to talk about some of the issues that they are involved in. Mark's question about the question of apartheid being able to survive. We hear this from one or two people and a couple of people who are involved in the military. I guess, the fact is that we've been able to show that the weapons were coming to the apartheid regime, that the government of China was a supporter in terms of the provision of weapons from the early 1980s, throughout the 1980s. If anything, the contact between the government of what was then called Red China, which is mainland China, and the apartheid government was intensifying towards the end of the 1980s. So we could imagine a situation where we could have been much more of a North Korea. There would have been continued oppression of ordinary people, probably accommodation of different elites. But it's an important story and an element we thought to focus on, because right now sometimes there's a frustration with the discussion that we have that seems to suggest that there were just a small group of people who sold out. Our leaders sold out in the liberation movement in the 90s during the negotiation process. And perhaps a reminder of how powerful this network were that they were up against, and how important that negotiation process was to stop the war and the death and murder of many people at the time. And then Liz's point around the arming of apartheid. So many of the weapons we're talking about are far more sophisticated, conventional, different weapons, missile systems and fighter jets and other things, which the liberation movement simply didn't have. They didn't have the similar kind of standing army as the apartheid regime had. So the suppliers would not, we think, necessarily be the same, but in some instances they no doubt were. We see weapons from the so-called Eastern Bloc, so from East Germany and elsewhere, finding their way into the hands of the apartheid government, and certainly from countries like China, to the extent that we think the Chinese government may have been supporting the ANC. They were always much more lukewarm about the ANC until the 1980s and closer to the PAC. So the networks, I think, of the big corporations, those contacts aren't quite the same.
So I think just one or two things to add. What I did want to highlight, simply because I think it's also going to be an important fight going forward, is that some of those access to information battles that Henny's just described are ongoing. And in fact, a matter has been set down in the Gauteng High Court for August, where the South African History Archive will be challenging the South African Reserve Bank to release apartheid-era records that they have into investigations into certain individuals from predominantly from the 1980s. But that, for us, is another instructive example, because we have now essentially got the Reserve Bank to the point where they admit that they have records about investigations into someone like Vito Palatolo, the famous international criminal and mob boss, conducted in the late 1980s, but that it would be detrimental to the interests of the country for them to release that information to us. And the Reserve Bank is a classic example of one of the departments that has been almost immovable in the ability to release information. We'll also be going ahead, SAHA will also be going ahead against the Department of Defense in the next year. And we have still outstanding information requests to Arms Corps and the Auditor General in regard to a De Beers transaction that we still cannot get information from sort of 5 years later. Henny very strategically dodged the state capture question, which is potentially the trickiest, and I'm also going to dodge it, but just in a different way, to say that I think you raise an important point about how certainly the way language gets adopted in popular debate, and then it gets very fuzzy because everything starts getting lumped in, and we start referring to any sort of attempts to capture the state. And there's no doubt that we have to be careful when there's quantifiable difference. The ability to almost single-handedly deploy a cabinet minister is pretty crazy. But on the other side of that, what I think I would argue is important, and it's one of the reasons that the tagline to the book is A Tale of Profit, is that regardless of the attempt to manipulate the state and how it's done, whether it's party funding, whether it's another source of influence, the continuous and the element that stays the same throughout is profiting, and profiting at the expense of the public. So whether you're trying to position someone in the treasury in order to profit, or as Nkosi-Kona's point is, if you are influencing a premier in order to ensure that land is not set aside for social housing, you're essentially corrupting the process. And I think we should call it corruption, because we often don't when it comes to private sector apps, but you're corrupting the process for the sake of profit. And very often in these cases, as we see, whether it's international bankers or whether it's domestic businessmen, it's super profits. While we live in the crazy society that we continue to live in.
Janine and Nkosi-Kona, do you want to jump in on this round of questions? No? Yeah. Oh wow. Nobody wants to tackle the state capture issue. Yes, well, let's have another round of 3. Then I have one here, second one there, and one revolve here. Yes, at the front, please. The front.
Here's one
here.
here.
The front.
And then there's one.
My name is Robert Koopman. Just something, I know it's not a book launch, but just something on the book. I really enjoyed the book because when I was in the 50s, 60s, we used to read those James Chase and all those kind of stories. And there were no footnotes and there were no referencing. And yeah, I was reading a book, but more or less the same kind of line, but your referencing has been so superb. Thank you for that. Secondly, on the book, maybe the subtitle should be The Tale of Tainted Prophet. Because I always get the impression if you romanticize the type of prophet that people generated, it could just influence others to, through this line you could also make profit. It's just a sidebar. What I would like to speak about very quickly, and you don't make mention about it a lot in the book, obviously there might be volumes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 coming, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the work done. Initially when it started, I was very excited that I thought a lot of information will come out, and at some point, and maybe in the week while I was rereading some pages in your book, I thought there were 2 letters that had to be added to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that is justice and restitution. And I wonder, because for me, now looking back, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what has happened was just a slap on the wrist of many of those who were thugs, quote unquote. And maybe what we see happening at the present moment is probably due to the fact that, man, there will be another Truth and Reconciliation 2 in the year 2019. I feel, although from a Christian side, I feel, okay, people need to speak and we need to accept what they've been saying. But I mean, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission should have gone a little bit further. There should have been people hauled in front of courts. There should have been, and I think somehow you did mention some of those guys, who should have been thrown in jail for all my money. And at the present moment, I'm calling the legacy of benefits. Many of the children and families of those who have been through this period and have benefited are still benefiting. And maybe the way that they are benefiting and the way that they speak, and they still treat South Africans in this country at this present moment. I mean, you read about how, especially so blacks and coloureds are being treated, and wages and all those kind of things. That has not gone away. And I think maybe this has also had an influence, probably to my mind, on the many young people of the present regime and leaders in our country. If you look at the way that those youngsters are acting and how they get away scot-free in some of the things some of the cases that came before the courts. I wonder if it's not a repetition because you actually follow in your leaders' footsteps as well.
Thank you. There's a lady at the back there.
Hi, my name is Pilile. I'm a researcher. Can you hear me? Yeah, you can.
Your name
Pilile, I'm a researcher at UCT, land rights and law. I have 2 questions, but I'm going to try to make them one. They're interrelated. The first question, Henny, is it just latches on to Liz's question, and it's about the provision of arms to, say, the liberation movement. A lot of the research that I'm doing currently is with regards to land rights in KZN, and that has to do with the Ngonyama Trust and the establishment of the Ngonyama Trust, which is a very unique act, the Ngonyama Trust Act. It was passed 2 days before elections, for those of us who don't know, and it was passed to transfer rural land in KZN to the Ngonyama Trust. And it happened in the backdrop of an intense civil war that was going on between mainly the ANC and the IFP. And speaking of open secrets, there's a big open secret that the apartheid government was feeding arms to the IFP during that war. And some people then say, well, it was also feeding arms to the ANC, and we don't really know what's what. So I just like to know if in your book you address that, that's the first question. The second question, which relates to that, is my interest in the Ngonyama Trust is multifaceted. One of the main interests is the social psychology aspect of it. Achille Mbembe calls it colonial rationality. Fanon also wrote intensively about it. How post-colonial governments, not just the South African post-colonial or post-apartheid governments, but governments in post-colonies globally seem to or appear to adapt the same kind of rationality as the colonial authorities. There's a psychological element that's going on there. And this is my main interest. It's a comment and a question. I'd like you to comment on that. I mean, with the Ngonyama Trust, I'm looking at the trust, the wording is the same thing. It's just copied and pasted, and a new trust is created. Well, a new trust, but it's actually a colonial trust. With the colonial era and the apartheid era, state capture can almost be justified. You know, you have people who see other people in a particular way, and that racism sort of justifies the deprivation of people's human dignity, in a sense. When you have those people doing it to their people, then there's a social psychology element to it that I'd like you to comment on.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, our third question has graciously withdrawn his question because it was asked on the TRC, so we can take one more question from the back. And if you can introduce yourself.
I'm standing as well. Okay, so I'm Mario from the Right to Know campaign, so I think people in the panel, we know each other. I have I've got friends. Yeah, friends and comrades. So my question is about the way forward, and I think just to link again the systems of apartheid corruption that you've spelled out and our contemporary problems of I would say the crisis of state capture. There are many steps that we can take as organized citizenry, as mobilized communities towards challenging apartheid secrecy and the release of those documents, and to challenge the secrecy of contemporary, of our contemporary politics. But there's now a policy proposal for a commission of inquiry into state capture, and many people are now calling for a commission of inquiry into apartheid era corruption, or maybe making it part of the same purview. You've been through the Sariti Commission on the Arms Deal. A number of us, we all stood by and watched this thing, and many of us have lost faith in the power of a commission of inquiry, especially under the current climate where we've actually seen that a state that does not wish for the truth to come out can use those processes to ensure that the truth doesn't come out. Or if it does come out, it can sort of be marginalized and whitewashed. So what alternative means exist for us to actually unearth these truths and to act on them? If you know, just let me know. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think it's the first question and the last question that was asked, I think, were related around the Truth Commission. I mean, around the commissions of inquiry and the Truth Commission process. I think that the challenge of tackling impunity, I think one of the questions that we do need to grapple with, and this is not trying to flog the old horse of did the TRC do things right or wrong. I think the TRC was of its time, I would argue, was of its time. The difficulty of, I'm frustrated on the one hand as a South African that the TRC didn't deal with economic crimes. I do think that business got off, and I think that all of those actors you've described, many of them did get off. I do know if I step back for a moment and look at, again, just looking at the documents, at the power of some of these actors, I realize how hard it would have been to truly hold them to account through the TRC. And I say that with the benefit now of hindsight, which I guess is what we all we all have, and therefore a deep sense of frustration of what the legacy has been of not dealing with many of those actors. But what I would argue, so all I can say is, yes, I do think that many people got away. I think that business arrived at the TRC and said, for example, we suffered the most, we were isolated, we didn't make money, and you read some of these transcripts, and it's kind of amazing to see these men in suits appearing almost as if they want to be known as victims at the TRC, and I think that needs far more reflection than it was ever given, perhaps at the time, and I think still is even given right to today. But this question that Robert and Murray had both asked around commissions, the TRC, the commissions of inquiry, I think brought the commission's inquiry as an instrument. I had the misfortune of being called to appear before the Seriti Commission of Inquiry into the arms deal because of work that myself and others have done in the past. And as a result of civil society calling this commission a whitewash, which I believe it was, or at least a cover-up, myself and other colleagues decided to withdraw from the commission and refuse to testify. And till today, I believe in the power of democratic institutions, and we participated because we wanted Judge Seriti's commission to work. But equally, it was painful to watch this commission aiding and abetting a cover-up to an extent of not asking the right questions, of not allowing information to be admitted into evidence. And that amazing moment when you're suddenly told by the commission that you can only present evidence to the commission of which you are the author. So then basically what you have are the arms dealers and these corrupt guys in institutions, and then the poor whistleblowers who we now anticipate from institutions who must come forward and stand in front of 50 lawyers who are going to chew them up and try and tell the truth, never mind what's going to happen to them once they leave the room. And it's a terrible situation that to place anyone under, particularly, you're almost forcing those few whistleblowers in the state who did author the documents to come and stick their head above the parapet in front of all those arms companies, and then good luck. So I do think, reflecting on it, it's a true example of how commissions of inquiries can be a space for abuse, for cover-up, and for continuing the cover-up of the truth. Nkosikona, I think, can tell us a little bit about SJC's powerful role, though, which is a different commission, and maybe to reflect on, I think, your role in Khayelitsha, and the SJC powerfully ensured that there was a commission of inquiry that did work, and I'm not going to talk to that. But I do think on commissions that deal with crimes and grave crimes, particularly political crimes, I would be deeply concerned if someone is going to announce a commission of inquiry under the current circumstances, with the current interference we've seen, I believe, of the executive into these things, that if there were to be a commission of inquiry into apartheid-era corruption, whether it would just be potentially a sham. And I equally, we can see the pushback against Advocate Madonsela's state of capture proposal. So I'm sorry, I'm at length there, but some views on that. Is it Camille, or I just couldn't hear you? Pilile. I did think Pilile. Tim and I were. Thanks, Pilile. I think your points on those social psychology questions and how we tend to mimic our own oppressors at times, I think is an incredibly important one, and just as a point to make. And I guess it's also a powerful reminder that we enter into these, although we have the law, a democratic constitution which has a particular vision, in a real world, of course, we're also inserted into an international environment that hasn't fundamentally changed, even if our constitution has a vision of something different. One of the reasons why it was important for us to look at all of these different players, international players, now, and some of their interests in trying to undermine the democratic state. I'm not taking away the responsibility of our leaders who are mimicking the patterns of the past, and I think that's an important one. I guess just to maybe add to it is that additional pressure that's placed on these corrupt and networks who have corrupted our politics for very long, and there was no reason for that whole system to change overnight.
Thanks, Henny. I'm going to invite the panel maybe to say 1 or 2 words in closing, and you need to let me know if there's a burning question that's still out there, but it doesn't look like it. So we will have the final round of commentary, but just to pick up on Murray's point, and Murray is the part of the team that helped to research this book. He didn't mention that at the beginning. And he mentioned the difficulty of getting information. And Henny talked about paid Twitter. I'm not sure if we're all familiar with paid Twitter. And maybe we need to unpack that a little bit. We should not assume that everybody knows what paid Twitter is. It's Twitter that is paid. But it's part of a disinformation campaign. Fake news, you've heard from Washington. It's designed to conceal the truth by inundating you with other forms of information that are not real. So some say we exist in an era of post-truth. And I did forget to mention that we have a hashtag, Apartheid, Guns and Money, which you can follow from now on. The conversation continues. That is not paid Twitter. So, Janine, we'll start with you and we'll come this way and we'll end with Henny as well. Cool.
Okay. So I'm going to take a jab at that state capture influence one. And I'm less diplomatic than Michael, even though he's younger than me. I keep waiting to get this diplomacy thing right, and I keep saying as I grow older, but it's just not coming. So, I mean, this influence is not just influence, it's not just a word, it's not, you know, what you read in the dictionary. So, if access by those with money has more influence in political structures, in our government, more influence than the ordinary citizen, then that is a problem. So I don't think we should just talk about influence as if it's just, you know, influence. And I say this because when we do at MVC, when we do our work on political party funding, we talk about how political party funding, private secret political party funding, impacts on not just possible corruption, but it also impacts on people having access and being able to influence policies of political parties, the decisions that they take. And then on state capture, I mean, yes, it's about money and it's about power, but it's also about being able to influence decisions. So that influence is part of this big state capture problem that we have, just as corruption, he mentioned corruption, or Michael, just as corruption is part of this, you know, this thing that we now, you know, have termed state capture. If you think about when Fakey Mentor first started writing on Facebook, she said she was offered a ministerial position if she would make the decision when she became minister to cancel a certain route that the SAA used. So I mean, you know, that's also, it's about influence. That's, you know, influence is also, it's an issue. It's not monetary, we can't, but it's a big problem. And then in closing, I wanted to say that, I mean, Henny mentioned the challenges that people have with trying to access information using PIA. It's a very frustrating process, and I think it's even more frustrating if you're someone in your community who really, really needs this information in order to do your work, and you are frustrated. I know Henny and them, in some cases, it took them years to get information through PIA, and in some cases where they were denied, they then had to go to court. Our government would say it's great, we have this wonderful access to information legislation, but actually, for a lot of us, it's not working. As MVC, we used it last year with our political parties. It wasn't so frustrating for us because we didn't really expect that the political parties would give us the information. It was part of our process. But I do understand the huge frustration behind it. And with regards to PIA, MVC has launched a court case challenging the fact that PIA does not allow us to access, you know, information, funding information of political parties, which will be heard in Cape Town in August. So we are trying to fix a part of that legislation that we all find so challenging.
I think just trying to take a stab at several of the questions that have come up about state capture and how to move forward. I think that one of the bedrock things that we have found through the research and what has sort of come up over and over again is that any notion of individualized or localized notions of state capture and corruption are inevitably problematic, because it's about systemic secrecy, and it's about systemic concentration of power, and it's about systemic freezing out of any institutions in the democracy that can hold other actors to account. And I think the question on the TRC and some of the others that have come up have had me thinking in the last year about what would happen if the NEC did recall Zuma and the Guptas had their citizenship revoked and it all changed in 2 weeks, right? And I think there's a very worrying sense that that would relieve far too many people too quickly about the nature of the systemic problems in South African politics. And I've even seen, I think I've seen a few politicians already talking about, well, 2019, if it keeps going this way, NC will probably lose a majority, and then we can have a new CODESA, and maybe even an economic TRC, and then move forward. So that's maybe the language that's being used. And I think that what we would argue is that we've seen how a lack of accountability works, and it doesn't work particularly well. So I think as a citizenry, and this maybe goes to what Murray says, is that one of the things we have to be doing as citizens is demanding trials and accountability wherever we can, and rejecting negotiation wherever it's possible to reject that. This idea that as long as we can get Zuma out, it doesn't matter what happens to him, because once we've got a new person in, everything will be better. And I think the discussion we've all been having, we all now know that that's not the case. And that should be the lesson, I think, going forward.
Just on my last remarks, is just to say, conversations like these that we're having now are very meaningful and are very important. But also, it doesn't end here. That there's a lot of work that has to be done. And just to echo the previous speaker, if Zuma has to resign, or if we recall Zuma from his position now, that would not change how things are in South Africa. There's still a lot of work that we have to do in our individual capacities, and in our structures the organizations that we believe that belong in. The fact that if the informal settlements dwellers are marching tomorrow to say Zuma must fall, if Zuma falls, that doesn't mean that they'll go back home and have a house. That the falling of a Zuma will just give a hope to people that, because as NGOs in Cape Town, we have came together to actually form what we call Unite Behind, because we understand that the corruption that happens nationally has got an impact into the work that we do locally. When we're fighting for or advocating for well-located housing, that will not just happen by itself. It needs resources and it needs money from the national government to fund provincial and local government to build houses. And for the informal settlements development, that needs money as well. So we kind of understand that for us, the corruption that happens nationally is not isolated from the demands that most of our people and our members are facing on the ground, that we have to unite behind stopping the capture of our country. But the call that I'd like to make to everyone is that this doesn't end here. And it doesn't end on Twitter, not the paid Twitter. And it goes beyond that. Dismantling the Apartheid government took people to leave their jobs and to go on the streets and join actions that are actually trying to address that. And I'd like to challenge everyone now. We're gonna very soon organize a big march in Cape Town, where we'll be marching when people are voting in Parliament. We'll have our vote outside, and we want to invite the IEC and have the people's vote, have people voting against Zuma to fall, and count how many people in South Africa and Cape Town are in support of the fact that we want Zuma to step down. So the main point I'm making is that it doesn't end on these platforms, but it goes beyond just talking about this. We have to organize, and we have to make sure that we take actions forward to address the issues we're facing in our societies.
Thanks, Tim. I think that's Nkosi has ended us on a very powerful note. I think in terms of the need for us to be able to find common ground in order to challenge these concentrations of power within both the public and the private sector. And quite clearly, undoing this is not just a question of moving individuals, but it is about focusing on the disparity of wealth, of income, of the many challenges that we face as a country. When we look at the issue of accountability, though, I would like to just mention one or two things in addition in terms of the apartheid era corruption, and we really don't want to be having this particular conversation in 20 years' time. And I think so for a start, while there are many good efforts right now, like with the work of Unite Behind, like the work of My Vote Counts to challenge the secrecy around party funding, like the work of Right to Know to challenge the secrecy that prohibits citizens to access information, we also think that there are other efforts that need to be made to tackle the lasting legacy of apartheid corruption in some ways. And as Open Secrets, working with others, we are joining a call as well to demand the declassification of the entire apartheid archive. Like countries like Germany and others have done after the end of National Socialism, it's imperative that that entire archive be declassified so citizens can understand our past, can help understand what the impact is, to stop this process of some people having information about other people that's used as a tool in these complex political machinations and backroom dealings, and for us to have access to this. And I think that's something we should have called for 20 years ago, and it's a powerful reminder why moving ahead, our right to access information is fundamental. And I do want to say is we didn't only write this book because we want a book that's a reminder of who was involved and that is able to name and shame, we hope, some of those who are implicated. But we are looking at ways to try and hold at the very least this particular bank in Europe to account. It's time that the financial sector in particular is reminded that this type of activity that it plays in other arms deals, and the IJR works, I think the IJR does work across our continent where there are many conflicts. We think about the South Sudan right now and other countries, and there are no doubt banks that continue to play precisely this role. And we hope to find ways, legal ways, to hold this particular bank to account in order to show that this type of activity should not be able to repeat itself, and we hope that others will join in this journey. And I think certainly we should be joining journeys like those that Unite Behind are helping to foster and to mobilize around. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Henny. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I think Henny he's opened up a Pandora's box. And when we cast our gaze into it, it's not really pretty. The past is not what we thought it was. There is a lot of continuity. So I think we should also make that very sharp distinction between state capture and influence. And you gave us the example of Thompson CF, which corrupted the apartheid government, which changed its name to Tallis, which corrupted the post-apartheid government. So there's a form. Alleged. As soon as that could be the second book following this series. So I think it's very important for us to keep working on these issues. As Michael mentioned, it's going to be a very difficult fight going forward. I think I did want to mention that it was a very personal journey for Henny. He didn't mention that. As an African, South African, white child of parents who did not complete their schooling, a grandchild of concentration camp inmates and prisoners of war, and he lists among his ancestors refugees, aristocrats, a bloodline of peasants and scoundrels of both black and white lineage, which I think he's which is why he's very comfortable provoking us to call out the bunch of Australian crooks. And there's continuity with the penal colony of Australia. So, I think South Africa is not unique in the world. It's very important for us to be aware of that. In terms of our experience, it's not too late to confront these historical injustices. We dare not forget the madness of apartheid and the indoctrination which happened during that period, which is going to be a major challenge to undo. As Michael called, we need to take legal action where we can. So I think the authors didn't mention this, but perhaps those of you who can provide pro bono legal counsel, you are called to serve. Lawyers in the room? No, and then now good lawyers in the room. I think it's vital to continue to fight for open, honest government on a daily basis, so that the views of the powerful are not taken at face value, and we need to check globally. Globally, we need to check on the really destructive role that sinister, conservative, deep state forces are playing in world politics, particularly as democracies lurch towards the right in Asia, Europe, and the United States of America. So this is a call then to active citizenship. You are also summoned to pick up the mantle. Complicity is not only about pulling the trigger, but requires ordinary people to acquiesce and agree to give power to those who use it against us. And I take these words from Henny's book, so those are not all my words. As a pitch, you've got to buy the book, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So finally, let me thank the panelists who've joined us, Henny, Michael for the book, Murray as well, Janine and Kosikona, who were last minute, and you were very brave, coming through and sitting on this panel as well. IGR colleagues who've been working behind the scenes on this, Caroline, Veronique, Sam, Gugu, Ashanti, and others, and you for taking your Thursday evening out to learn more about the need for us to keep the secrets open secrets, and to engage more in exposing all that's going on in our country and elsewhere around the continent. So thank you very much, and have a pleasant evening, and you're most welcome to